Again, feel free to be a part of the conversation, and if there's other questions that you want to ask Kavitha once she's done, then we can open up and then. So I couldn't think of anyone else to end our lecture series but you, because we started the Dissent in Dangerous Times lecture series with Maza Mengistu, who was an Ethiopian writer whose own uncles had been disappeared during the Red Terror. And she spoke about what it means to bear witness in an age where we have a billion images online. And then we had Stephen Thrasher talk about what it means to be Black and gay in a predominantly imperial racist society. While he is accepted being Black and gay in this country, he's always had discomfort about being with his own body. Yeah. And through that, he spoke about what it means to be a brown body in this country, whether it's Abu Ghraib, or if it means to be African American, if it means to be, if you're incarcerated as a Muslim soon after 9/11, or again, the larger history. Then we had Kalyan Nadiminti talk about 9/11 and silences in American literature, but we also had Muhammadu Salahi, who was the author of Guantanamo Diary, Skype in, which was one of the most, we really had interesting audio connections, but it was still one of the most powerful testaments of what it means to be human, despite all the torture and the horrible experiences he felt. We had another panel with Veterans Against War, where we not only spoke about Philippines, we also spoke about North Korea, but also militarization of American communities, our own families, and our culture. And from idea of seeing to inhabiting, now we are here finishing up with the idea of what does it truly mean to be a citizen and to belong? What does citizenship and belonging mean in this globalized, traumatized world? And I said earlier, I couldn't think of anyone else better to have this conversation, because when it comes to migration, when it comes to these issues, the person I go to or I look up to or would like to hear from when something happens is Kavitha. And that's not only because she is a wonderful writer, a scholar, and many, many things, but she's also someone who's very humane and generous in terms of how she looks at something. She's one of those people who can tell you an incredibly beautiful story of what happens in a family, and then somehow take you through what happens and why that family is important to you in the much larger world. And then again, go back to that family and back. And that kind of storytellers are few and far in between. And I'm really thrilled that you're here today. She's also here because she's one of the most fiercest people I know. And if you want to learn anything about migration, citizenship, or belonging, there's no one else better. On that note, it's your stage. And please tell us what is it that we should be thinking about and talking about. And we will open it up, and then we'll have a longer, more organic conversation.
That's great. Thank you all for coming. I'm so excited about this. And I'm also excited about the wait list, even though I guess people got deterred by it. I mean, it's nice to know. I remember when I first started talking about citizenship and migration 15, 20 years ago, and you could barely get two people to care about it, And it's kind of gratifying that people realize that, this is one of the most, I think, transformative phenomena in the world today is migration. And I think it is that because it encaptures within it so many other phenomena, and it's also prompted by so many other things. It's triggered by violence, by climate change, by hope, by fear, by desperation, but also by just, what architects call the dream lines or dream paths, the pathways that, I've had so many conversations with people who talk about unaccompanied minors and cannot understand why a parent would send a child on top of a train with smugglers, across miles and miles, but the answer is always somebody else did it, and it turned out fine. So there's something about migration that's both individual, that's collective, that's universal, that's global, but it's also very, very specific to the person, to the family, to the countries that you're leaving from, the countries that you cross through, and the countries that you ultimately arrive at. And there are a handful of countries that kind of shape this idea of what migration really is. And just kind of as a contextualizing thing, what I wanted to say kind of to frame this discussion is to kind of underscore that for many, many years now, and certainly since 2001, we have emphasized not only that anti-terrorism has been, that migration policy worldwide, specifically in Europe and in other Western countries, that migration policy has been used as an anti-terrorism strategy. We have also pointed out how that has had negative repercussions, has caused all kinds of other problems, from the proliferation of terrorist networks to, unaccounted for and unintentional death, or even death as a deterrent strategies in countries that are trying to bar their borders and secure their borders. But what I think is this point has been emphasized a lot. I think what is less understood when we talk about migration and anti-terrorism strategy, we tend to focus more and more more exclusively on border security and limiting entry and keeping people out. But the flip side of this is how citizenship is manipulated, not just on the books, but in the minds of people. And so I wanted to kind of leave you with this initial thought, or I guess start you with this initial thought. What kinds of manipulations, both of identities, of ideas, and of policies, exist around citizenship today? And how are those ideas and manipulations also becoming as globalized as the pathways on which migrants travel? And I want to kind of return to that in a few minutes. First, I wanted to just open with a chapter. I just started kind of returning to the world of work. I've been dealing with some family issues for some time, and I had to take about a year-long break from writing about migration. And in that time, all of these issues around citizenship and belonging have become even more, I think, traumatized, even more violent, and even more troubling. So I had the opportunity to write a chapter for this collected volume on borders and mobility in South Asia. And I was able to bring in some of the things that I've been thinking about before, but also to kind of examine some of the newer changes, like what's been going on in Myanmar and the crisis there, and some of the challenges that are emerging from this increasingly sea-bound population of Bangladeshi economic migrants. And so I wanted to kind of just briefly read a little bit from the opening section of that chapter for you, and then we can get into the discussion. Shyam Rai entered Nepal on the flatbed of an Indian lorry when he was 4 years old. He was hemmed in on all sides by a sweating forest of knees and thighs, one person among the estimated 90,000 people who were expelled over the course of half a dozen years in the early 1990s from the Kingdom of Bhutan. Stripped of their Bhutanese citizenship in 1989, coerced or tortured into conceding to voluntary emigration, the Nepali-speaking Hindu people known as the Lodchampa, or Southerners to the Buddhist Bhutanese, crossed into India as refugees, the women smuggling their Bhutanese passports in their bras in hope of reconciliation and a return home. India then deployed its army to the border under strict orders to remove the refugees, which they did by piling them into Tata trucks without medicine or provisions, let alone seating in safety belts, and driving them to the Mechi River, dividing India from neighboring Nepal, where they herded them across the watery border and left them stranded on the opposite riverbank. For months, while they waited for distant powers to sort out their fate, the Lodchampa camped in the open air in the jungle beside the riverbank, plagued with hunger and disease. Rai describes a ghastly scene, calling forth the disconnected images and eerie sounds characteristic of traumatized early memory, as he speaks of babies dying all around him of cholera, their cries haunting the unlit night. For nearly 3 decades, the Lodchampa hung in limbo in refugee camps, sometimes having to work as undocumented seasonal migrants in cities in Nepal and in neighboring India, and eventually the majority were resettled as refugees, primarily to the United States, but also to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, and the United Kingdom. Some still hold out for a return to Bhutan, a country that does not want them back, and some wish to claim Nepal as their home, even if it refuses to accept them. Others still decouple their sense of nationhood and homeland from physical geography or paper citizenship. And in a sense, the Lhotshampa are a people created more through their rejection by different dominant groups than by their own volition, who are perceived as migrants, even though it was national boundaries that moved, not them. In different nation-state settings and into their eventual and continuing dispersal into a global diaspora of sorts, they have accumulated various and overlapping migrant statuses and existed in multiple and often contradictory states of exclusion and marginality, even as they increasingly comprise a large percentage of the global refugee population that has been formally resettled in third states and with accompanying economic and social rights. Although their collective experience of migration, refuge, and dispersal is both driven by and to be understood within its own historic context and the interplay of religious and ethnic dynamics in place that has retained its independence in a region in many ways defined by colonization and post-colony, the Lhotshampa can be taken as emblematic of larger inquiries into citizenship and belonging in contemporary South Asia, as well as of globalized and globalizing migrations. Efforts to locate their national identity and citizenship claims can be extrapolated not only toward the understanding of the experiences of other refugee populations in and into the region, like the Rohingya of Myanmar, but of marginalized minority communities in countries dominated by national politics, like Muslim citizens of India. And amid an exodus of often unauthorized migrants from Bangladesh, traveling in the same fraught pathways as refugees and settling among vulnerable urban Muslim populations in India. South Asia in the 20th century and today is a site not only of hypermobility, but also of negotiated, disputed, and in some cases, imagined borders. Identity communities forged by migrations and resettlements, forced or otherwise during imperial and colonial occupations in this region, must navigate questions of belonging in countries that have continued to grapple with national identity through the post-colonial era and well into the age of globalization. And I kind of go on to talk then about, some of the different populations that we're looking at. So here in this story, which I then eventually return to, we meet this guy, Shyam, who is a stateless person, a refugee, a migrant worker, and an unauthorized migrant all at the same time. He's collected all of these different statuses. He is emblematic of kind of an older problem where you have a community that is rendered stateless. I mean, we're talking about, the Syrian Kurds, 1963. We're talking about Haitians in Dominican Republic. We're talking about, any number of populations, the Rohingya, who were rendered stateless in 1982. All of these populations that have had their citizenship taken from them. And then they are subject to ethnic cleansing. Their claim to being in a certain place is questioned. They're forced over international borders and often housed in large refugee camps, the Somali Bantu, kept in these large refugee camps for decades on end, where they essentially learn the business of being kind of unagentic, of not having agency, of not being empowered, of having to rely on, and I mean, their skill set requires navigating the kind of the care and aid system, how to get something in a camp that you're entitled to, live that way without proper education, or are educated by religious missionaries, and live that way for decades on end, only to be resettled in a place where they have access to rights, but not really support infrastructure. The Bhutanese Nepali, what's really interesting is the populations that have been resettled here in the United States have been resettled after 34 years. Nobody really knows about their cases. There are thousands of them, certainly in upstate New York. And at the same time, the undocumented economic migrant population from Nepal has been rising in that area as well. So you have some crossover relationships, and the ways that people are navigating existence, these same groups that see themselves as part of the same ethnic community, that see themselves as family in many ways, that are intermarrying more and more. Who has rights? Who has spent the longest without rights? who has access, who has belonging, who is a part of what, why do they relate with each other, what are some of the conflicts that are breaking out. This is fascinating stuff. And a lot of it speaks to the very profound differences in status that they have now in a same place and being from the same place, but also in their kind of cumulative experiences. Nepalis who arrive undocumented have been undocumented in lots of other places and have developed networks and skill sets for managing shadow economies and invisible networks, whereas resettled refugees have a very different skill set that may not necessarily benefit them as low-skilled workers in, economically depressed steel towns, So those are some things. So very briefly, I just wanted to kind of recap some concepts and history around the word citizen. The root word, of course, is city. It comes from this concept, the Greco-Roman concept of the city-state. So I think we have to ask ourselves what actually makes a citizen, and different countries have different models that they apply. Is it birth? Is it membership in a nation? Is it an application form with a bureaucratic process that accompanies it? Is it relationships to other people who have a claim? How is that claim defined? How is that claim understood by both bureaucracies and by the broader population? You can have legal citizenship and birthright citizenship, but still be seen as a fundamentally illegal or de facto illegal person in a place. Is it actions and behaviors? So citizenship theory, and I'm citing here Richard Bellamy, who is predominantly a scholar of Europe, but he has done some good work kind of recapping theories of citizenship. There are basically two types of theories of citizenship. There are normative theories that seek to describe the rights and duties that citizens possess, and this is rooted in ancient Greek and Roman concepts. Or there are empirical theories that kind of seek to describe how citizens came to possess these rights and theories. And some of the most influential empirical theories concern the development of democratic citizenship within the nation states. Revolutionary France, 1946 Italy, these kinds of concepts. There are three kind of main, in citizenship scholarship, there are kind of three main models of citizenship. The liberal model, which focuses on the individual, and that emphasizes the equality of rights, how these enable individuals to kind of pursue their aims and goals. There's the communitarian model, which is really just a critique of the individualistic liberal model, and that considers more the responsibilities and duties owed to the community. And then there's the Republican model, which I know is a bad word now, but it's the older version of the word Republican, which focuses on the roles and responsibilities of the citizen and emphasizes participation in government as the foundation for the promotion of civic good. There are newer models that kind of try to account for citizen activism or internet citizenship or transnationalism or cosmopolitanism. And there's some really great stuff that's coming out of the world of urbanism and cities that talk about, as opposed to education systems, how can living in a city, how can existing in a city kind of train you to be a citizen, not just of the state that you live in, but of this new world, this new increasingly urban, global, cosmopolitan world order, which, a lot of this is very kind of, blue-eyed and dreamy about cities. Most people who are newer migrants in cities aren't living as a part of this very exciting, gleaming skyscraper, global urbanisms. They're living in, occupied villages, basically, and in underpaid garment sweatshops and, factories. But, I'm not going to get into the Doug Saunders world of thinking here. We're going to just kind of keep it moving. What I really want to consider here, though, is the ideas of citizenship. What are some of the words that we associate with citizenship? If you look up definitions in even just Merriam-Webster, you see, or any kind of dictionary, you see a set of words that come up, and these words are native to, or belonging to, membership within. So to me, the conceptual associations are two. It's either of or belonging to a place or a land. And this is terrestrial, this is physical. What does it mean to belong to a land if indigenous people don't have rights to those lands, if migrants who are born in a place don't have rights to those lands? What does this mean in a world that's, where people are increasingly decoupled from like physical permanence, where there's mobility of not just of individuals, but of entire communities? If there are diasporas that are global, what is this terrestrial, physical belonging? What does that mean? And then there's the second issue, which is the second kind of conceptual association, which is even more problematic and confusing, which is of or belonging to community. So what community are we talking about here? Is it a psychological community? Whenever this is always the rub, right? Whenever we're talking about people, community is not about a physical association, it's about an association with a group of people. And whenever we're talking about people, this is where we get into the challenge. What is the collective? How do you define the collective? What is culture? What is nation? Is it possible to define belonging and inclusion without exclusion, or lack of belonging? Is there a can you have a center without a margin? So here's what I kind of want to interrogate with you guys is, obviously the concepts and theories of citizenship theory, like all scholarship in the canon today, is rooted in, Western European political and intellectual traditions. There are two quotes that I want to read to you guys that I think set us up for some interesting discussion. One is from Saskia Sassen, who writes mostly about urbanisms, but kind of she's great. She covers everything. Like she feels liberated to dabble in anything, and I love that about her. Saskia Sassen is so funny. One day I went to a talk of hers in Berlin, and it was like a rock concert. Everyone was there drinking and talking about urban theory. It was awesome. So here's
a glass of wine. We have 2 bottles.
Oh, I'm definitely going to do that. Citizenship this is from, and I actually brought a couple of titles that I want to share with you guys. I haven't put together a full reading list yet, but a couple of titles that really influence me. And I am not an academic, so just bear in mind that I'm just an autodidact in a lot of this stuff, and I just kind of read, and certain things stick in my head, and I keep them and then think about them when I'm traveling the world and writing about stuff. Citizenship is an incompletely theorized contract between the state and its subjects. And this is what I love about this quote. Further, it is meant to be incomplete. This incompleteness makes it possible for a highly formalized institution to accommodate change. More precisely, to accommodate the possibility of responding to change without sacrificing formal status. And then I want to read this quote to you by a younger scholar named Véronique Benaille, who wrote this book called Manufacturing Citizenship. It's also sort of more Europe-focused, but it talks about education and how education as an institution and as a practice can be used to produce citizens of the state. So she says, citizenship was from the outset an arena of contested meaning in 2 ways. Contestation and competition from different groups within an arena, and the exclusion of others, women, subordinate nationalities, slaves, colonial subjects, the urban poor, the working class, and the peasantry altogether. So citizenship, the Western European concept of citizenship, which is rooted in the Greco-Roman tradition, the Republican tradition, this idea that you are a citizen by virtue of residing in a certain place and participating in certain roles and activities and taking on certain responsibilities and duties, and by belonging to a certain community and being community-minded, that idea, which has now, since the mass colonization and of Western Europe, of the rest of the world, has become the dominant idea of citizenship around the world, even in places that didn't have those those kind of frameworks for understanding community and belonging and participation, or even documentation in a space, that concept has always been about exclusion. It's always been meant to be incomplete. It's always been about keeping some out and allowing for interpretation, for change. And unfortunately, I think increasingly in the 21st century, that change that citizenship theory allows for, or citizenship infrastructure allows for, is repressive, is regressive, is racist in every country in the world. Like when we see a globalization of undocumentedness, which I really think we can make the case for, and I think part of the problem is just data on migration are so incredibly poor and unavailable. We rely, if you look at UN data on immigration, on migration, this is one of my drums that I beat over and over again. I mean, they rely on national censuses and reported surveys. What is the interest of India in accurately reporting, its tribal communities? Or what is the interest in any place of Myanmar in accurately reporting on, its Rohingya population? Like, what is the interest at even the Chittagong Hill tracts? You've talked to me about this in Bangladesh, or, no self-reported data can be trusted, of course. And migration data is all self-reported by people who choose to participate in censuses or not, by people who are available to participate in censuses or not, and then by nations that determine who should be surveyed and not, how data is kept, how it's stored. There's some really great new things that are happening where people are looking at new pools of data, through some of the things that are available through the big data and excitement there. But I think the main thing is that we don't want accurate data on immigration. If you look at data on migrant deaths, I would argue that the numbers are shocking as it is. 40,000 people over the course of half a decade. The numbers are shocking as it is, but those numbers cannot be believed. I mean, most people who are dying as undocumented migrants are traveling in invisible pathways. They're dying in the deep sea. Those bodies are not recovered. They're dying in mountain passes that no one looks at because no one wants to deal with them. Migrant data cannot be trusted. Data on refugees are only people who are in refugee camps, whereas most of the people that we meet in refugee camps are really the most vulnerable, the most lost of people who are fleeing. I met a woman who is a Karen migrant from Myanmar, and Thailand every country has a very different approach to setting up refugee camps than others. In Thailand, because they are surrounded by so many states in migrant crisis with crappy borders, they have very, very strictly militarized refugee camps. Those are controlled. People can't leave those camps to do undocumented seasonal work, like if you're in a refugee camp in Bangladesh or Nepal, or even to a certain extent Kenya. Those camps are very, very tightly monitored and militarized. So a lot of people from the Karen War in Myanmar just, wandered into Thai society and lived as de facto undocumented immigrants, endured immigrant raids, and then in order to be eligible for a refugee resettlement, they had to somehow spin these new documentations with new alter egos and identities that they had, and then return to military subjugation in these refugee camps. So, you're looking at a lot of complications here about what these excluded subjects really function like. So I wanted to give you a couple of vignettes, a couple of stories to consider that sort of destroy these simple ideas of how one gets citizenship. Just brief recap. Obviously, there are three central ways that you get citizenship under the Western European model of citizenship. That's either to be born in a place, and that's always the case. For example, in Germany, you can only get birthright citizenship if your parents have been legal immigrants in Germany for 8 years or longer, or if one of your parents is ethnically German. that's only since 1999. So all of those guest worker treaties that took place throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, none of those people were really eligible for citizenship in Germany. Now we have this very new kind of crisis that spawned the Alternative für Deutschland, which is the fact that 1.3 million refugees were theoretically welcomed into the German state. What that welcome actually looks like is a whole different question. How you actually even get to Germany from the southern Italy border is a whole other question. But we're spreading here. So a couple of things that I wanted to share is categories that come to my mind are citizens from states that are, so the birthright citizenship, and then of course citizenship by ethnicity, blood citizenship. That's called jus soli, jus sanguinis. So there's jus soli, which is you get citizenship by being born in a place. You get citizenship by being descended from people who are ethnically from that place. Or you can get citizenship by naturalization. How this actually functions in different states is widely varied. It's nowhere near as varied as how you actually legally migrate to a place, how you get a visa. There are many places that have become major immigrant destinations like China and India that don't even have a kind of a formalized immigration process. There's really no kind of coherence in migration policy, but citizenship policy is equally incoherent and subject to interpretation. So one of the categories that I consider are what I call citizens from confused states. And no state is more confused than Myanmar, in large part because ever since it got its independence, it's been at war for 50 years. The country, when it got its independence from the British, had a lot of different, it's at a crossroads. It's in Southeast Asia, but it has ties to East Asia and to South Asia. The region is very confused about what separates it or makes it, distinct from South Asia. And Myanmar is in a place where it's entwined with a lot of different places. It had a very unique relationship to the British Raj. It had a unique place in trade and in, Rangoon as a city had a very specific place as a trading outpost and was kind of a trafficking outpost throughout the British Raj and during the Opium Wars. So from that day on, Rangoon, if you go now, Yangon is a profoundly multi-ethnic city. You see a lot of different people from different backgrounds who have been there for many generations. But in 1982, which is the latest of a series of progressively restrictive citizenship laws, in 1982, the state decided that what it was going to do was kind of formalize the idea of Burmese citizenship to a group of 135 different ethnicities that were identified in the last British census before the British departed. Now, can we trust a colonial ruler to accurately census your population and define your ethnic groups? Can we even trust a population to as a colonial ruler to accurately name your populations or identify who speaks what and who lives where and how and why? So the basis for Burmese citizenship is confused, it's confusing, it's weird. And then in practice, it's even more confusing and weird because the state, even though it was an authoritarian, totalitarian state, unlike many other totalitarian states, it was a thin state. They didn't have a big bureaucratic infrastructure. They have no documentation. For years, the public schools had no books. We're talking about an insulated, insular population that was not only, shut off from the world for decades, but was uneducated and was essentially confused and in a permanent state of war with 16 different legally recognized ethnicities. The state has been at war with its own people forever. So the peace process is unfolding as the city is now, as the country is now trying to understand who belongs and who doesn't. I'll give you 2 examples. I met this Christian man who says he's ethnic Chin, which is one of the official ethnic groups of Myanmar. But he's Christian, so he's considered, his claim to citizenship is socially, less valid. But it turns out we talked for several hours, and finally at the end of the conversation, he kind of admitted that he speaks a dialect of Mizo, which is the formal official language of the Indian state of Mizoram. So it's not considered an official language of the state of Myanmar. So even though a large percentage of the Chin actually do speak Mizo, if they were to admit to a public official that they spoke Mizo, they would be classified as Indian and categorized as foreigners. So that's a category there. I also met a young Muslim man who is the child of an ethnic Shan woman. Shan is a legally recognized ethnicity of Myanmar. And his father is the son of people his father's grandparents migrated from a state that's in contemporary India. Because he is Muslim and because his great-grandparents migrated from India before independence, he is on his passport officially categorized as Pakistani. Because of that, even though he would have no legal claim to citizenship in Pakistan, has never been to Pakistan, even if he were to return to where his great-grandparents are from, he would be in India, and he would be a Muslim there, which good luck. But if he ended up he ended up applying for, as part of a student group trip, to travel to the UK, and because his passport says that he's Pakistani, he was the only one in the student group who was denied a visa to enter the UK. So you have these kind of weird repercussions, this fallout from this. The second group is what I like to think of as legal citizens who have no rights or protections. When we talk about citizenship, what is citizenship? Is it simply just belonging, or is it a state of having certain rights and responsibilities, but also protections? So we have citizens. So let us consider the case of a 15-year-old sugarcane cutter in Tamil Nadu in India. He's a seasonal migrant. He is underage, according to Indian labor laws, which are not enforced. And he's working in debt bondage or slavery, which is also illegal under Indian law. And he is a native-born Indian citizen. What kind of citizenship does he have? What kind of legal rights, protections does he have? How is he accessing his citizenship? Let's also consider the case of an 82-year-old woman who I met in the Mississippi River Delta. She's not working, she doesn't really have an education, and she's undocumented because she doesn't have a birth certificate, doesn't have a driver's license, doesn't really have photo ID of herself proving that she's here. And she can't vote because where she lives, strict voter ID laws apply. So what kind of citizenship does she enjoy, right? What is the value of her citizenship in that case? Third category I'd like to think about is asylum without security, leave alone safety. So this is an area that I'm very interested in because we're talking about, refugees versus asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are generally, certainly in the United States, asylum seekers are generally better resourced. They're kind of similar to undocumented people because they're able to arrive here on their own resources and then apply legally, for asylum after the fact. Let's consider the case of a biomedical engineer from Uzbekistan who's living in Philadelphia. She's an asylum seeker. She was an asylum seeker for many years. It took about 7 years for her to get her asylum approved. For all that time, she had no legal right to travel or work until the asylum was granted. And let's consider where she was in her third year of legal limbo. She was working off the books as a home health aide. She was a legally trained biomedical engineer with 2 PhDs, and she's working as a home health aide. She was eventually granted asylum, which has a direct path to citizenship, but she did spend many years working illegally in this country. What punishments, what risks does she face there? And then let's consider the case of 2 Indonesian domestic workers in Long Island who were enslaved for 2 years by legal Indian citizens, Indian Americans, U.S. citizens, Indian Americans on Long Island for about 2 years. Very, very high-profile asylum case, modern slavery case. They won asylum, but today they're both homeless. They are working as domestic workers off the books. They have asylum, they have a right to work, but there's kind of no real path out of that kind of state of being an enslaved person that's provided, right? And then let's consider the case of refugees, right? So right now, if we're talking about the Rohingya in Bangladesh, there's an estimated 800,000 people expected to be put into this ginormous refugee camp. At this point, I don't imagine any other resettlement that's actually going to take place with any kind of speed. Even if I hear nothing. Do you hear anything about a plan for resettlement?
No.
Part of the problem is that, the state is not allowing inspectors in to kind of document whether there is actually continued genocide happening or, what the ethnic cleansing actually looks like. So you can't move forward in any kind of international thing. And here I want actually for you to weigh in, because I don't actually know what the international law is or, around how you set up a resettlement or how you actually get the international community to exert pressure on a state that's engaged in genocidal activities. So you have these people who are in this refugee camp. The refugee camp itself is a wreck. There's no proper toilets, there's no education, there's no food. Bangladesh is struggling, with its own crises, the seasonal flooding and, exodus and economic migrants, and that part of Bangladesh is not resourced. So what kind of state? I think the most ideal circumstance for the Rohingya is what ended up happening for the Bhutanese Nepali. And really, I think to get a resettlement, you kind of have to have a rabbi, really. You have to have somebody who goes to bat.
Very good rabbi.
You have to have somebody who goes to bat for your cause.
Actually, you need a prophet. You don't need a rabbi. Rabbis don't cut anymore.
You need a messiah.
You need a messiah. You need a prophet who walks on water.
But
then you might not.
But like the Bhutanese Nepal, it's kind of fascinating who gets resettled.
Yeah. And often it's politics. It's politics. It's nothing to do with. For instance, when we were trying to resettle Iraqi refugees from the Middle East, which is mostly Cairo, where I was trying to do that, and then for some reason in Jordan, the resettlement was easier. The UNHCR and the IOM office in Jordan were just resettling far more Iraqis than anyone else.
Jordan has. They have it. They handled the whole Palestinian refugee crisis. They had the capacity and the willingness to resettle about 400 Iraqi refugee families over a course of a year, which is quite phenomenal. That's great.
But Cairo, the years that I spent there, consistently failed to fill their quota. Yeah. And often they would just, whatever quotas that they couldn't fill, they would just pass it on to Jordan. Yeah. And some of it came from the fact that the people trained by UNHCR were often not lawyers. Yeah. A lot of them were young Egyptians who had gone to really good universities like the American University in Cairo or the American University in Lebanon, but never quite understood what it meant to be a caseworker and go through a case. Yeah. A lot of it is institutional racism in the countries that you live in. Yeah. And the most horrible resettlement interview that I ever sat with for a client, this was someone who had been... he was from Rumbek, he's South Sudanese. Yeah. His family had been killed. He had moved to Cairo when he was barely 9. Mm-hmm. And in Cairo, there's a huge gang problem, which meant that his head was almost decapitated by a gang member. So you can see his scar running all over. Mm. And actually, sorry, this was at the American Embassy, not the IOM. So the American embassy that was interviewing him, the caseworker or the person from the American embassy interviewing this he's really tall, but for me he's a boy. He was still this young boy, was upset, was going on leave the next day, refused to give him breaks, which law is supposed to give all refugee interviews breaks. We sat for 8.5 hours, and 3 months later, his petition was turned down. And I couldn't think of anyone more deserving of resettlement.
Right.
And yet, this was someone who was American, who had all the capacity to.
Yeah.
This was someone who was well trained, well educated. But the moment the person walked in, they were going on leave tomorrow. And often it's not some big institutional. It's that one person, and imagine making someone sit for 8 hours and just having them speak without a break.
I mean, that's the thing. It's the one person, but it's also the system and the wind at that person's back, right? Mm-hmm. So a couple final bits about citizenship. I want us to think citizenship laws are not set in stone, but the big changes don't happen that often. So some of the big changes that we had in the United States, and we had this Nationality Act in 1952 that was nonsense. It was all about race quotas. It was crazy. The big reform that we had was in 1965. Now we're in a position where that is under question. Obviously, we're in a particularly nationalist moment here, so I don't see Congress undertaking this at any point. But it's more campaign talk, red meat for the base, that kind of thing. But the question that now is being posed, that was never really posed before, is family-based immigration, valid? Should there be a path to citizenship for high-tech, highly educated, H-1B visa holders, those kinds of things? Citizenship itself is being questioned here in the United States. How that actually functions on the ground in interrogating who belongs and who doesn't belong is very visceral right now. I mean, I think there are some very clear questions. There are very clear lines being drawn around, who is a protected member of the state and who is not here, and that's changing. In Europe, we are seeing, although in Germany, for example, the latest big law, the citizenship law that was passed was in 1999. We are seeing kind of a broadening of who will be allowed in and what a path to citizenship actually looks like. In places like Germany and Sweden, there's always a disconnect between the theory and the practice because the bureaucracy is so invasive and so involved. There are a million tiny ways for the bureaucracy to fail basic human decency. For example, if you are a refugee or an asylum seeker in Germany, you're automatically given psychological counseling, and that goes into your file for consideration. But you may, for example, this is something that happened a lot with the Kurds, because they were seen as citizens of the Turkish state. They were often sent to doctors or psychologists who were Turkish, who would basically recreate the ethnic cleansing and re-traumatize them, discount their claim. So there are all kinds of challenges where bureaucracy can kind of reproduce violence. So that's something that happens. In India, I wanted to kind of read you a quote from a book called Paper Citizens. If you guys are interested in citizenship at all, you should check this out. It's a tiny little volume by this guy named Kamal Sadiq. And he really does a very interesting job of talking about how illegal immigrants get documentation in developing countries, how, unauthorized, and most immigrants are unauthorized because in many places, there's no real way to be authorized to enter the country. I mean, places like Bhutan, Malaysia are doing a lot of things with guest worker treaties. Mexico in 2004, I believe it was. I have to go back to my notes. In 2004, and Tunisia in 2006 started developing some immigration policies. A lot of these immigration policies in North Africa are being basically literally dictated by European countries that are interested in reducing the flows on grounds of preventing terrorism. So there are immigration things there. The Mexican immigration law was written with a lot of influence from the United States, obviously. And I think, what's really happening is that Mexico, as a result of the United States' obsession with reducing immigrant inflows over the southern border, Mexico is becoming kind of the major immigrant destination, of North America, and is also dealing with some of the traumas, but also some of the advantages and benefits of that reality. But here, this is a very interesting thing. So Indian citizenship actually began very civic. I mean, the Indian Constitution after independence is a profoundly revolutionary document. Indian citizens are guaranteed a ton of different rights, as we have talked about with our slave, our sugarcane cutter slave. It's very difficult for the Indian state to actually, allow people to have access to those rights or to implement its vision in many ways. But so Indian citizenship began very, very civic note. It was a regime of ius solis, which is birthright citizenship, but it has evolved into a more exclusionary citizenship regime. And all of this is kind of oriented to basically to Pakistan. But there was a long period of restriction that was oriented to the Sri Lankan crisis and after the Bangladeshi independence war to kind of stem the flows of people from Bangladesh. He writes, the curtailment of Indian citizenship by imposing restrictive residential requirements, by narrowly defining persons of Indian origin to ensure their Indian nationality, security of the political rights of Indian citizenship from the claims of the diaspora, all reflect a growing anxiety on the part of the Indian state towards new and old outsiders. It seems that the nation has to be protected from ever-ready stream of illegal immigrants waiting to contaminate the fabric of Indian citizenship. And central to these concerns have been the elimination to claims to Indian citizenship by Bangladeshi and Pakistani nationals or their descendants. That's the central concern. So this goes back to this interesting thing with Kashmir when we talk about the Indian border. When we always talk about the Indian border, we always talk about this highly militarized border with Kashmir. But other Indian borders are non-existent, really. I mean, the northeastern borders are totally porous. And the peoples who live there live and move freely on all sides of the borders. In fact, there is, as of 1950, an open border treaty with Nepal where people can just come and go as they please. And because of that, there's this kind of, very bifurcated sense of, what it means to move in and out of the country and who has a right to be in a place. And so India is a confusing state where, at the same time that those northeastern borders are totally open, India is increasingly, demonizing people who are coming in from Bangladesh and Muslim immigrants. And basically this is now turning into, a part of this Hindu nationalist narrative. So we were talking about the globalization of undocumentedness earlier. What I am seeing is kind of as a part of this post 9/11, anti-terrorism through immigration policy is a globalization of anti-immigrant sentiment that's coupled with Islamophobia. Now, Indian Islamophobia is, of course, very, very different from, even the AFD, NPD, and Pegida type of Islamophobia of Europe, and of course the Islamophobia of the United States. Islamophobia of the United States cannot be decoupled from anti-Black racism. It's how it takes its forms, it's how it's understood, it's how it behaves. All kind of phobias or collective phobias stem from how we practiced racism after and during slavery in the United States, and that's unique here. That's not how it feels in Europe. In Europe, it's, especially in Germany, there's a lot of stuff about ethnicity and, nation and national identity. It's not about race as directly, and religion and overpopulation myths and all of that. In India, it's hard to tell. I think there's a willful ignorance in India about who Muslims in India actually are. There's an unwillingness to actually do the basic demographic research to understand, where are our Muslim communities? How do they live? What languages do they speak? What types of Islam do they practice? those kinds of, that information is just not available in India. So that enables these kind of pre-genocidal panics, this idea of the birth rate, the overpopulation, the violent Muslim man. I mean, I can't even tell you, even after all of the gang rapes, which have made international headlines around the world, even after all of that, how many people say, oh, well, it's these, Muslim migrant workers. They're different, they're this way. I'm like, those were all Hindu dudes. What are you talking about? So, it's, this stuff is deeply embedded. And certainly with the Rohingya crisis, we can see that. I mean, just walking around Myanmar, you can talk about all kinds of things with people who are democracy activists who gave their entire lives, who worked really hard, who are good people, who care, and who just blind spot, just, well, they're foreigners, it's very, very rare to meet even a very left-wing, progressive ethnic Burmese person who will even admit that there's been...
And you find that in Sri Lanka as well.
Sri Lanka, the same thing, yeah.
The idea that there was a Tamil genocide.
Yeah.
There were war crimes against...
Yeah, they can't
Tamil,
admit it. So I guess I went on and on. I've been sitting with my thoughts for a year. Thank you guys for indulging me.
I'm going to kind of ask you 2 questions and then open it up for the audience. One is the question of documentation. And we've spoken about documentation in many ways. Whether it's going into Burma and documenting how many people have been.
Yeah.
Right? But the question is, they have been documenting Burma. Even the little information we have should be enough for us to say this is not happening.
Yeah.
Second, there is documentation of, say, African Americans in this country being pulled over by cops constantly, again, treated as nothing more than target practice.
Yeah.
That's being documented.
I mean, how can you see that video of Philando Castile and
yet
see it?
Right? So there is documentation, and yet despite documentation, again, I'm not saying there's complete documentation,
right,
but there is enough documentation for us to move us into action, and yet that never seems to happen. I was kind of wondering you could speak to that. And the second question is, as everybody knows, there's the Ai Weiwei exhibition in all of New York City. Mm-hmm. Good fences make good neighbors, and every time I cross any of those installations, I feel like I'm going to have a coronary. Simply because I know everybody's written very... there's the Ai Weiwei exhibitions and installations around the city have been well reviewed. But for me, the installation is a function of another neoliberal discourse on reducing everything to... Today, the Ai Weiwei exhibit in Washington Square Park, which is the one that's now the most famous of the 100 other ones, is nothing more than a selfie spot where people really don't engage with the idea of migration. There's no, and yet that is a discourse, right?
Right.
That kind of links to the documentation.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could kind of have your thoughts on that, and then we will open it up for more one-on-one conversations.
I just love talking with you. You always have the best ideas. So the documentation thing is really interesting. And I think this is where we get into the nationalist question. So documentation by whom, how credibility, and how credible and legitimate by whom. So a lot of documentation exists. Unless the state grants legitimacy to that documentation or incorporates that documentation as data in the advancements of a policy agenda or of a reform agenda, that documentation is just stories, ideas, opposition. We are increasingly, in the United States certainly, but in many countries for a long time, we've seen, just this idea that the free press is not to be trusted. Germany, we see a return of the concept Lügenpresse, which means lying press. We have fake news here. The press is not to be trusted. The press has been significantly censored in India. What troubles me is not just the idea that press freedom is central to any kind of democratic enterprise, and that it should be considered legitimate documentation in the advancement of any kind of democratic exchange on policy, but that the press can't really be trusted by us either. The press in the United States right now, for example, how much coverage is anyone seeing about the Zimbabwean coup? How much? Well, you're reading it. That's your neighborhood. You're looking for it, right? How much coverage are we seeing
Twitter.
about Syria?
Sadly, I don't know, sadly or happily, a lot of people have been going to Twitter for Zimbabwe, right? They're reporting. They're looking for people from the ground to tweet.
I haven't seen the Times. Where is the Times on this? Where's Washington Post on this? They are so engaged in the business of being an opposition to an increasingly proto-authoritarian, regime, that I don't really think that our press is terribly reliable on global coverage. I mean, our press has been increasingly unreliable on global coverage forever, but we just can't find proper coverage. So, what is the role of and the responsibility of the journalist? Is the journalist supposed to be a documentarian or a voice? Position, holding, speaking truth to power, and holding authority to account, holding a leadership to account. The second issue is, on the documentation front is, obviously the journalists are documentarians, but I think one of the main challenges, certainly on Myanmar, has been this idea that, the international human rights watchdog groups are biased, and they are. They are. I think there were times early on where, I think the initial ethnic cleansing, the initial exodus of the Rohingya in 2015 was terrible, and there was great suffering. But I think a lot of that comes from this is an unpopular position, but I think a lot of that came from, the thinness of the Burmese state and the incoherence of the Burmese state and its inefficacy, its inability to deal with certain things. It was trying to cleanse the Rohingya. That is undisputable. But it wasn't actually at that time, I think, trying to perpetuate genocidal violence of the scale that we've found in the first week of September.
But there has been, for 30 years, you had
violence, yes.
And
dehumanization, steady dehumanization.
Right.
And it's been documented well overseas. But if a state doesn't read those reports and doesn't act on those and doesn't feel shamed by that stuff, if the state doesn't feel shamed by police violence and brutality towards its unarmed citizens, then what, how can we change that narrative? So I think this goes back to what we were talking about, like in the very beginning. We can see all of the steps that take place that lead towards marginalization, exclusion, dehumanization, and then eventually ethnic cleansing and genocide. We can see we can trace those steps. We can see the press propaganda. We can see the state propaganda. We can see the laws that change over time. We can see the disparate treatment of, misdemeanors from one community versus grand felonies from another community. We can see all of those over time. But where does the de-escalation come from? Does it actually come when you have journalists and, watchdog groups that treat themselves as opposition to a state? How can you engage with a violent state? How can you engage with the state that is criminal? How do you actually partner with that state to get that state to change and to do the right thing? I think those are the questions that I still haven't really, where do you go from documentation to reform? This is always why I question my own work. I tell these stories. How do we actually get those stories to change? There was always kind of a belief that, journalism is the Pulitzer has a whole category on, journalism that drives social change, that drives policy change, but it doesn't really happen that way anymore.
I don't think it's happened for a very long time.
Well, and I also think part of the problem is, so on immigration, certainly in the United States media on this issue is really a mess. On immigration, you just always see the same narrative. Desperate victim makes good. Even if the intention is good, desperate victim makes good. Desperate victim works 8 jobs, even this unconscious thing that we do about who is deserving,
Right.
who has a right. And I mean, the whole refugee resettlement regime, the whole asylum regime is based on documenting your fear, is based on...
And your loss.
And your loss. And traumatizing yourself for the benefit of some, impartial arbiter to determine whether you've suffered enough to be given a frickin' break already, Right. So, I mean, the whole system is based on these kinds of like putting yourself into a narrative. The narrative of the illegal immigrant in the United States and certainly around the world is you're either less than human, you're invisible, or you're superhuman. You have to be somebody who is willing to endure inhumane amounts of tragedy and suffering in order for your story to be worth telling. You have to be a child who was raped by narco traffickers and came here and worked from the age of 15 and it's
and then got to Harvard
and then went to Harvard all on their own. The
Sorry?
picaresque novel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have a question. So when you say like how can we reform or how can we change things and how can we develop the state, my question is always, does the state care?
Yeah.
And if they don't, how can we make them care?
Yeah.
Because it usually seems like they will only care if it benefits them.
Yeah.
And so what are we supposed to do?
Well, there are different states, right? So, I mean, I think certainly in the states that we've been talking about here, Myanmar, India, the United States, there's supremacy happening. So there's race supremacy, there's ethnic supremacy, there's religious supremacy. There are nationalist movements that are founded on the idea of one group is threatened and deserves to fight back, white genocide, what have you. So those are different. There are other states that mean well, that want to do good. South Africa, for example, wants to be the rainbow nation, wants to be a post-revolutionary state. There are challenges. There are other states like Brazil, for example. There are other things. There are other governments than a federal government. For example, if you go to India, right, you can't get, there's residency requirements. You can't get legal documentation, but you can get, if you get a ration card somewhere, then you can essentially function as a citizen of that city. You can vote. There's a lot of corruption. It's difficult. You have to kind of negotiate to get your paperwork. If you go to Bangkok, if you can finagle a way to get a municipal ID, then you can live as a regular citizen. China, even if you're a native-born Chinese citizen to this day, if you move from Beijing to Shanghai, then you're an illegal immigrant. You can't own property, you can't get married, can't send your kids to school. And then you have all these weird shadowy economies. It's completely insane. So this idea of documentation, there's that level of documenting wrong in the service of advancing a change. But there's also how people get around belongings. I mean, cities have all different kinds of ways of documenting people. And I'm not just talking about municipal IDs and city IDs. There's municipal citizenship in Germany where you can have communal voting even if you're not a national citizen. Here you can be a green card holder in New York and not vote. There are parts of Corona, Queens, where 30-40% of the population is legal immigrants and they have no franchise. So what is the value? It depends on, different places. So I think there are certain states where different things are possible. In Brazil, for example, if you're an undocumented domestic worker, from any other part of the world, you can have your day in court if your employer is exploiting you. If you are having your rights violated under Brazilian labor law, you can actually access those rights in a court of law. It's not always perfect. There's corruption. There's all kinds of issues. But there are so many ways that states, like there's municipal state, there's state, there's federal states. What happens, though, is when you have a national federal state that is based on a supremacy model, how does that trickle down? How when you have essentially, there are people now who are arguing that the United States is on its path to being a failed state where local governments and state governments have to fill in the gaps for what a federal government should be doing, but refuses to do because it's now based on a supremacy ethos. In that case, I mean, we have to get in the street. We have to march, obviously. We can't just sit around and be like, oh, it's the federal government, whatever. People have to do that, but we also have to acknowledge that that's not where the change is going to happen for the time being. That's not where the protections are going to come. You can't actually make a state that's invested in a supremacy model change its ethos, without, filling in the gaps locally,
And that's why organizing matters so much, right? Because
Yeah.
that's why the state now is afraid of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Because that means something. And that's happened in Kashmir as well. In 2010, after the insurgency, 1 million Kashmiris were on the streets in Srinagar.
Yeah.
These were young, most of them the younger generation of Kashmiris coming of age, who said, you know what, we're not going for the insurgency, but when you have 1 million people on the street, it's easy to kill that one kid with a gun.
Yeah.
But 1 million people on the street puts the entire Indian state, and that's why they tried so hard to. And that's true with the Arab Spring when it started in Cairo. People on the street actually scares a heck out of governments, whether they are democratic, whether they are authoritarian. It's not enough. It's never enough.
I think the United States is a different story, and certainly Europe too, because there are protest cultures. There are kind of cultural modes where it's not terrifying to see a large march in the United States. That's just, it's seen as kind of a benign, toothless.
No, it depends on the color of the march.
Depends on the color of the march. And the size, I think if it's a very, very large march that's kind of cuts across a lot of different cross sections, then it's not really considered a problem. How many people got in the street before Iraq? How many people? That doesn't change. That no one was afraid of that. I mean, this is a tangent, but I no matter how insane the Twitter president is, he has not yet legalized torture and taken the country to war on a lie. So, I mean, not yet a war criminal. So, I think we have a long history of having some very, very...
But also you forget that Obama was
a war criminal.
Droner-in-chief, and not to mention the fact that he...
The mass deporter-in-chief.
Which means that, again, the question goes back to the individual, right?
Yeah.
The individual versus the state that's already in place that does... Of course, it matters whether you have an Obama or a Trump, but at the heart of it, does it really...
This question of citizenship, I think a lot of people felt lulled into a sense of belonging in the United States under Obama because...
True, yes.
It's charismatic leadership model. It's Weberian. It's like we look at this guy and we're like, oh... we on the left tend to laugh at people on the right for saying they'd like to have a beer with that guy, but I think the majority of people on the left... Not the hard left, obviously, the activist left, but like liberals, neoliberals, felt like, I'd like to have a beer with that guy.
Because people thought he was made... Who said this? Somebody said this, right? Some comedian was saying how people thought he was made of magic. But also you had all these writers of the left, Zadie Smith, to Christopher Hitchens when Hitchens was still alive, identified with him because he was a good writer.
He was a good writer. Smart guy and awesome wife, beautiful children.
But then how
memes,
the policies...
so many memes, silly memes,
Sorry.
Yeah, to just, kind of the way the discussion is going right now kind of brings up a broader point that I kind of wanted to add to the discussion, which is we were talking earlier about how the media in the United States deals with immigration. Yeah. And to me, the deeper narrative about it is always beyond obviously the trope of like the genius and the criminal, but it is also always of these people who are living in the margins and are not that they're not already integrated into the society.
Right. That's true, right? Because it's what society? I mean, how can you function here if you aren't integrated into some society?
And which is one of the reasons why I think that the last time we really had a legislative shot at some kind of, immigration reform in the United States was about 10 years ago, when there was a general strike of all undocumented people.
Yeah.
And it didn't end up going anywhere. But the thing about covering protests in the United States that's always frustrated me in my time in activism is that there is a discourse about covering protests.
Yeah.
And I think that oftentimes, I wonder why it is that the time I've spent in India, they haven't discovered this, as much. I think they are now, but as much, which is this idea that when people go and march, and it's very fair to your point about it depending on what color you are, but, at the same time, there's been a neoliberal discourse applied to, other forms of, protest by people of color. It's just that Black Lives Matter is so, they do things that are considered to be so confrontational.
Disruptive.
But, I'm sorry, let me just finish this. Oh, there's another thing that I really wanted to say, which is, the failure also among people who seek change in the United States is not adopting tactics that make that neoliberal discourse from the media fall apart.
Yeah. Well, I think also we shouldn't forget that India is a post-revolutionary state. Places like India, like South Africa, the protest, the march has a holy place in the psyche, in the collective psyche. There is not an Indian who doesn't shiver. I mean, even me, I was born in this country at the thought of the Salt March. I mean, it's deeply moving part of our psyche, our collective psyche. This idea that, and we all know the facts. We know that the British Raj ended because they just didn't have it together to hold on anymore. It wasn't us marching in the street, making salt on the seashore. That wasn't what ended the colonial occupation of our country. But, we feel deeply invested in that narrative. So, I mean, to this day, this idea of grassroots organizing, this is where we talk about, citizenship and belonging in a place like India there is a national thing. There is a citizenship policy. And increasingly so in contemporary India. But belonging is so kind of local, and, it's about your family and your name and your caste and your language. And it's very, very grassroots. And we've had this conversation. So opposition, organizing, radicalism is hyper-local, like beyond local. It's deeply grassroots.
Often it doesn't even cross class and caste lines.
No, it doesn't. Honestly, I think that's why it's so effective, because people get out and they relate to each other deeply. I mean, you have an economically driven Band in India or a strike, and you can get like 1 million people on the street, because it's not ideological, it's not political. Whereas I think in a country like America, we are really struggling to kind of define belonging communities and communities of belonging. Like, I think even on this idea of the left, there's some of these divides. I think it's really easy to ignore, how incredibly fractured these conversations are on the left. Like, we've had I think what we initially wanted to have a conversation about, and maybe next semester we can come back to this or some other point, was, what does solidarity actually look like, between anti-Black racism advocates and other folks, when the conversation, I think the large conversation that Black Lives Matter really opened up is this conversation about privilege. And does acknowledging your privilege actually relate, and how does it actually relate to a sense of belonging and to ownership of reform and policy change? So I think that's a kind of a very niche conversation of the same broader ethos, which is how do communities of practice and communities of emotion connect to communities of idea, and what is actually community where, your relationships are largely ephemeral, global, transitional, identity-driven, what is community, in the United States, this is a huge issue. In other places that we're discussing, not so much, When you're talking about, organizing around migrants' rights in Thailand, it's very, very local. It's specific to certain communities. The fact that there's such a multitude of languages, the fact that most of these cities and most of the world do not reflect the dominant ethnic composition of the rest of the country in which they are. Bangkok has nothing to do with the rest of Thailand in terms of the types of people that you see on the street or the languages that you hear spoken, And I think the same can be said of Joburg, I think the same can be said of New York, Global cities are very different places. London, So I think nationalism comes when there's a kind of a structural imbalance between the voices of the cities and the voices of depopulated places. Alternative für Deutschland is predominantly supported in places where there is no diversity. And they have more kind of institutional voice than other places. And so I think this comes down to another idea of what citizenship is. I think for a couple of years I was involved with this project over at Carnegie Council. It was a centennial project, and a book came out, and it's totally it's a brilliant project, and it's fantastic, but it was very much about kind of coming in for an intense period of time and trying to understand these very complex places. But, I think, Ignatieff has a really interesting quote or an idea about what egalitarian or equality actually means. And I don't know that it's actually, true universally speaking, but I think it's definitely true in the United States and certain other places. The idea that equality means equality of voice, not necessarily equality of outcomes. Like, you want to have a seat at the table, you don't necessarily believe that you're going to have equal standing in the rest, in the rest of society. I think that's a really interesting thing to debate. What is the fundamental right of a citizen? Is it economic rights? I mean, that's why we aren't agitating more for communal voting rights or, non-citizen voting rights in the United States. I mean, for many, many immigrants, access to, economic freedoms here in China is all that's really needed. Access to political participation is not necessarily the priority for a lot of people, until we realize that, the veil has been lifted and we have a supremacy state. And, if you don't participate politically, then who knows how many steps you are away from ethnic cleansing, right?
But there's this really fascinating quote. I was reading this today that how, in the height of the civil rights movement, you have these conversations between Martin Luther King and other people. And he says that, yes, we want to integrate, but what is the point of integrating into a system that's burning itself down, right? So yes, we want equality, but do we need equality by whose standards are we?
Equal to what?
Equal to what? Do you want to integrate in a system that is so racist and that is based on settler colonialism? So what we'll do, we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
First,
How are you guys feeling about all of this, by the way? Is it too much of hodgepodge? We're having fun?
I think we have a lot to think about.
We're having fun? Okay, go ahead.
Well, it's a Thursday night and people are here talking about citizenship and belonging, so they're having lots of fun.
Obviously we're a self-selected group.
So what's the implication here? Like, citizenship is acquiring a new meaning, or it's being rendered meaningless? The way I thought of it initially when you started talking about the book and the example you gave was, is this new meaning about the fact that we are becoming less and less permissive of heterogeneity of any kind when it comes to the notion of identity?
Right.
Or could it be, or is this mostly about that everybody is vulnerable, but some people are more vulnerable than others?
Yeah.
So how is the vulnerability distributed among people? And that ties back to what you're explaining as the either the fading relevance of citizenship or it's acquiring a new meaning.
Yeah.
It's a very hot question.
Well, so no, I love it. I love it because this is where I think we're going. Citizenship either means everything or it means nothing.
Yes.
Right?
And you cannot include without excluding.
Right. There's a guy, a legal scholar who I'm sure a lot of you guys know. You probably know him. Anil Kalan, who's a professor at Drexel University in Philadelphia, has written a lot of really interesting stuff about there is no such thing as illegal because there's really no such thing as legal immigrant. Like, really, the gold standard of belonging is citizenship and having access to all the rights and protections of citizenship. Anything short of that is not citizenship, right? So even if you're a fully legal, legally incorporated immigrant with, a social sphere and social network and capital and blah, 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 and degrees and rights and all of these things, if you don't have the full franchise, if you don't have access to everything, then you don't have access to everything. So I think that's a very traditional view of citizenship theory here in the United States, which is that, or of just the model of citizenship, which is that everybody should get citizenship somehow. And then we'll figure out accessing citizenship after the fact. But if you have people who are for generations a part of this country and then don't have access to the full privileges and protections of citizenship, there's an emotional and an identity, a social aspect to that, right? To me, I wonder what is the leap between mass deportation and ethnic cleansing? Can we consider the mass deportation of people who have been in a country, who are not legal citizens of that country, but who have been in a country participating in that economy and in that society and in those communities paying taxes, to a certain extent participating politically, to whatever extent they're allowed? Can we consider those people of that space, of that nation, who then, through mass deportation, are experiencing an ethnic cleansing? Because mass deportation is racialized, is ethnicized, it is militarized, right? So can we make that logical leap? I mean, the lawyers in the room will probably have a lot to tell me about how that's not possible and I'm wrong. And I don't think we can really consider, I think obviously we get a little kind of Americocentric and with American exceptionalism here. I think when you look at the sheer scale of misery and violence that most states perpetuate, we're still our institutions are functioning to a certain extent in the United States. So citizenship does function here. Citizenship in the United States is so different from citizenship everywhere else too, right? So the question of, is citizenship even possible, I think is the main problem. And I think what really becomes the big challenge is that the majority of countries in the world, first of all, don't have the desire to really make citizenship available to all people who are entering into the borders, or to enforce or implement citizenship on behalf of all people who are natural-born citizens of a place. They also don't have the bandwidth or the capacity to do it. Can you imagine giving everybody rights and protections in a bankrupt, an economically, financially bankrupt state like India? I mean, how much would they have to tax the Tata family to do that?
They don't tax the rich.
Right? See, that's part of the problem.
They actually do tax the middle class to pay off the debt of the rich in India, but is that everywhere else? Should we wrap it up? Because I think we're lying a little over. So this would not be possible without Hamad here and making this possible and giving us a space. And
so fantastic.
And I actually wanted Hamad to do the concluding remarks because he's someone who's held my hands through trying to get this organized, and he's so I also wanted him to kind of finish the concluding part.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming. I am part of a group, the South Asian Scholars and Students and Scholars at the GC, as part of the Doctoral Students Council. And we hope to have many more events like this. We are still going to collaborate with Suchitra for next semester. And I really want to thank you all, but also the presenters, you and the other presenters are not here, but if if you can send them my thanks, because I think it's really important that these conversations are happening in this particular space. As a public university, we're really trying to fight to keep this commons space going as a commons, and to not privatize it and illegalize it. So it's really great that these interventions are happening in this space, and I thank you for that. And let's, if you all can come back next semester, let's keep sustaining this.
Yeah. And next semester, a dear friend, Michael Bush, is going to be curating the series. And the series we have is called Borders and Bodies. And he has more ideas and more interesting. Surprisingly, all the smart people we know are women. So it's going to be all women next semester. So I'm really kicked about it. But again, thank you for making this. And I'm sorry about the waitlist fiasco. I don't think I should have started the waitlist, but no, it's been wonderful. And I think Kavitha can stay back for a few minutes. So if you have, I know that you had some things that you want to talk. So have a conversation.
Let's stay in touch too. If anyone wants to.
And I also have emails of everybody who signed in, so I can again circulate the reading list and other things so that we can again take this conversation forward. But again, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It might also be the week before